July 17, 1942. The world was no longer merely at war. It had descended into a state of absolute industrialized madness. World War II had mutated into a global titan, a relentless machine of destruction fueled by the unchecked egos of the century's most powerful men. The pursuit of total dominance had pushed humanity to the very edge of the abyss, and the path forward was paved with the ashes of civilization. In the West, Adolf Hitler's Nazi war machine had already trampled through the heart of Europe, leaving a trail of iron and fire from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the East. The Führer's ambition was a bottomless pit, and now, he turned his predatory gaze toward the vast, untamed frontiers of the Soviet Union. This was to be the ultimate clash, the moment where the two most ruthless ideologies in human history would collide in a struggle for the soul of the world. Hitler's hunger for the East was driven by more than just a desire for land. He craved the lifeblood of modern warfare: oil. His eyes were fixed on the Caucasus, a region overflowing with crude oil reserves that could fuel his expanding empire for 1,000 years. But standing in his way was a city that sat like a crown on the edge of the Volga River, Stalingrad. This wasn't just a strategic objective for the German High Command. It was a psychological obsession. Stalingrad bore the name of Hitler's ultimate rival, Joseph Stalin. To seize this city was to do more than just cut a supply line. It was a chance to shatter Stalin's pride and seize the Soviet Union's natural resources in one devastating blow. It was intended to be a symbolic execution of the Soviet spirit. But Joseph Stalin was a man forged in the same cold, unforgiving steel as the city that bore his name. He refused to blink. For Stalin, the city was more than a hub of heavy industry or a transit point for grain. It was a monument to his personal power and the resilience of the Bolshevik Revolution. He tied the fate of the entire Soviet nation to the defense of this single patch of earth, ordering his commanders to hold the line at any cost. There would be no retreat. There would be no mercy. The stage was set for a descent into a literal hell on earth. Two of history's most remorseless dictators locked horns in a struggle that would turn the waters of the Volga red with the blood of millions. For months, a slow, agonizing dance of death played out amidst the concrete canyons of the city. Initially, the Luftwaffe, the pride of the German Air Force, pounded the skyline into a jagged graveyard of brick and twisted metal. Hitler was already celebrating in the beer halls of Munich, convinced that the Soviet spirit had finally been broken under the weight of German steel. But the King of Ruin had made a fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten that the Russian soul is most dangerous when it is backed against a wall. As the golden autumn faded and the skies turned a leaden gray, a silent, deadly ally joined the Soviet ranks: the brutal, bone-chilling Russian winter. The cold became the final nail in the Nazi coffin. While the German soldiers froze in their thin summer uniforms, their limbs turning black with frostbite, Stalin unleashed a tidal wave of fresh, winter-hardened Siberian troops. The tide of battle turned with a terrifying, violent speed. In a 7-month bloodbath, Stalingrad transformed from a city into a vast, open-air cemetery. By the time the last gun fell silent, nearly 1.9 million lives had been extinguished. It was, and remains, the single bloodiest battle in the history of human warfare. How did Hitler's invincible army, which had conquered Western Europe in weeks, crumble into dust here? What dark, desperate strategies did Stalin use to snatch victory from the jaws of certain defeat? This is the story of how the quest for Stalingrad became the eternal graveyard of the Third Reich. To truly understand the carnage of 1942, we must look back at the scars of the previous Great War, for the seeds of Stalingrad were sown in the mud of 1918. When World War I ended, Germany was a shattered nation. The Allied powers, seeking to ensure Germany could never rise again, imposed the Treaty of Versailles. It was a document of humiliation. Germany was stripped of its colonies, its military was dismantled, and it was buried under a staggering $5 billion debt in war reparations, a sum that meant generational poverty. The country spiraled into a nightmare of hyperinflation, where a loaf of bread cost a wheelbarrow full of cash, and the people faced literal starvation. The German people felt betrayed by their own government, the Weimar Republic, which had signed what they called the shameful peace. Among these disillusioned millions was a former corporal and failed artist named Adolf Hitler. During the First War, Hitler had been a low-level runner, risking his life to deliver messages through the mud and gas of the Western Front. He was decorated for bravery with the Iron Cross, but the German surrender left a bitter, poisonous taste in his mouth. He didn't believe Germany had been defeated on the battlefield. He believed it had been stabbed in the back by politicians, communists, and Jews at home. This conspiracy theory became the foundation of his rise. In 1919, Hitler joined the tiny German Workers' Party, eventually seizing control and transforming it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. He was a master of the dark arts of oratory, feeding a starving and humiliated population a lethal diet of grand promises, nationalistic pride, and the myth of Aryan superiority. He told them they were a master race destined to rule the world. By 1932, the desperation of the Great Depression had pushed the German electorate into his arms. His party became the largest in the Reichstag, and by January 1933, the aging President Paul von Hindenburg was forced to appoint Hitler as chancellor. Once the keys to the kingdom were in his hands, Hitler dismantled German democracy with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a butcher. He used the Reichstag fire to suspend civil liberties, crushed his political opponents, and turned the nation into a totalitarian cult of personality. He pulled Germany out of the League of Nations, viewing it as a weak talking shop for his enemies. In 1936, he took his first major gamble, marching his rebuilt army back into the Rhineland, a direct violation of international law. The world did nothing. Emboldened, he realized that the Western powers were too terrified of another world war to stop him. But Hitler's true obsession lay further east. To him, the Soviet Union was the ultimate existential threat. He viewed the Slavic people as Untermenschen, subhumans, and he saw the vast plains of Russia as the natural living space, or Lebensraum, for the German race. He began a massive, multi-year propaganda campaign to prepare the German mind for a war of annihilation. This wasn't just about borders, it was about the survival of the fittest. After absorbing Austria and dismembering Czechoslovakia, the German economy surged under a massive rearmament program. Hitler was hailed as a messiah by his people, but his ambition was a fire that required constant fuel. By 1939, Hitler was ready to strike Poland, but he faced a strategic dilemma. He knew that an invasion of Poland would trigger war with Britain and France. He could not afford to fight a two-front war if the Soviet Union decided to intervene from the east. In a maneuver that left global diplomats speechless, Hitler reached out to his mortal enemy, Joseph Stalin. In August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. The two dictators, who had spent a decade publicly calling for the other's destruction, agreed to a 10-year non-aggression pact. Secretly, they drew a line across a map of Poland, agreeing to divide the country between them. For Hitler, the pact was a temporary convenience, a way to keep the Soviet bear asleep while he devoured the West. For Stalin, it was a tactical masterstroke. He knew Hitler would eventually attack, but the pact bought him precious time to modernize the Red Army and move his borders further west. On September 1, 1939, German panzers rolled into Poland. 2 days later, the world was at war. Within weeks, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, and Poland ceased to exist. While the world braced for a long conflict, Hitler unleashed the Blitzkrieg. In the spring of 1940, the German army bypassed the impenetrable Maginot Line, swarming through the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. In just 6 weeks, France, one of the world's great military powers, collapsed. The British were driven into the sea at Dunkirk, leaving their equipment behind. By the summer of 1940, Hitler stood on the coast of France, looking across the English Channel at a lonely, defiant Britain. But the air war over England, the Battle of Britain, did not go as planned. The Royal Air Force, aided by the newly invented technology of radar, inflicted heavy losses on the Luftwaffe. Hitler's patience began to wear thin. He was a man in a hurry, convinced he had a limited time to achieve his destiny. If he couldn't knock Britain out of the war immediately, he would turn back to his original plan. He believed that if he crushed the Soviet Union, Britain would be forced to sue for peace, deprived of any potential ally on the continent. Furthermore, Stalin's recent territorial gains in the Baltics and the Balkans were making Hitler nervous. The Soviet Union was moving uncomfortably close to the Romanian oil fields at Ploesti, which provided the vast majority of Germany's fuel. Hitler decided he would not wait. He would strike the Soviet Union with such force that the entire Bolshevik structure would collapse like a house of cards. On December 18, 1940, Hitler signed Directive 21. Its code name, Operation Barbarossa. It was to be the largest military operation in the history of the world. Hitler told his generals, "When Barbarossa begins, the world will hold its breath." He was right. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German and Axis soldiers, supported by 3,000 tanks and 2,500 aircraft, smashed across the Soviet border. The invasion was divided into 3 massive prongs. Army Group North was to capture Leningrad, the cradle of the revolution. Army Group Center was to seize Moscow, the political heart. Army Group South was to conquer Ukraine, the Soviet breadbasket, and eventually secure the oil fields of the Caucasus. The initial success of Barbarossa was staggering. The Red Army, paralyzed by Stalin's pre-war purges of his best officers, was caught completely off guard. Thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and liquidated in massive pockets. By July, the Germans had advanced hundreds of miles. By September, Leningrad was surrounded and placed under a brutal siege that would last nearly 900 days. By October, the German vanguards could see the golden domes of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Hitler was ecstatic. He told the German people that the war in the East was already won. But Stalin, after a brief period of nervous collapse, found his resolve. He invoked the Great Patriotic War, calling upon the Russian people to fight not just for communism, but for the very soil of their ancestors. He ordered a scorched earth policy of unprecedented scale. As the Red Army retreated, they destroyed everything. They blew up dams, burned millions of tons of grain, and dismantled entire factories, brick by brick, and shipped them by rail to the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers. If the Germans wanted Russia, they would have to conquer a desert of ash. And then the climate of Russia intervened. In October, the autumn rains turned the unpaved Russian roads into Rasputitsa, the Sea of Mud. German supply lines, already stretched to the breaking point, slowed to a crawl. Tanks sank to their turrets. Horses drowned in the muck. When the mud finally froze in November, the German generals hoped to make a final dash for Moscow. But they were met by general winter. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The German army had no winter clothing, no specialized lubricants for their weapons, and no antifreeze for their vehicles. Thousands of soldiers died of exposure before they ever saw a Soviet bullet. On December 5, 1941, at the very gates of Moscow, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped with skis and winter gear, emerged from the blizzard like ghosts. The German army, exhausted and frozen, was pushed back. For the first time in the war, the Blitzkrieg had been halted. Barbarossa had failed to deliver the knockout blow Hitler had promised. Hitler was undeterred by the winter catastrophe. He blamed his generals for the failure and took personal command of the army. In the spring of 1942, he prepared a new plan, Case Blue. He realized that Germany could not win a long war of attrition without more resources. He abandoned the total front-wide assault and focused all his remaining strength on the south. He wanted the wheat of the Don Steppe and, most importantly, the oil of the Caucasus. As the German tanks began to roll again in June 1942, they seemed invincible once more. They smashed through Soviet defenses in the Second Battle of Kharkov, capturing 250,000 prisoners. But as the offensive progressed, Hitler's strategic focus began to wander. he became obsessed with two targets simultaneously. He ordered Army Group A to drive deep into the Caucasus Mountains toward the Baku oil fields. At the same time, he ordered the 6th Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, to capture Stalingrad. Originally, Stalingrad was meant to be a secondary objective, a way to protect the flank of the oil drive. But as the summer wore on, the city became a personal grudge match between the two dictators. Stalingrad was a sprawling industrial giant, stretching for 30 miles along the western bank of the wide Volga River. It was the home of the massive Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, which had been converted to produce T-34 tanks. For Hitler, the city was a psychological prize. For Stalin, the loss of his namesake city would be a political death sentence. He issued the infamous Order Number 227, Nichivo Nazid, not a step back. He forbade the evacuation of the civilian population, famously stating, "The soldiers will fight harder for a living city than a dead one." He turned the city into a fortress, and its citizens, including women and children, were forced to dig anti-tank trenches under the heat of the summer sun. By August 23, 1942, the German 6th Army reached the outskirts of the city. The Luftwaffe launched a massive aerial bombardment, dropping over 1,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries. The wooden houses of the city's periphery vanished in an inferno. The massive stone and concrete buildings of the center were reduced to skeletal ruins. In a single day, tens of thousands of civilians were killed. The sky over the Volga turned black with the smoke of burning oil tanks. To the German observers, it looked as though the city had been wiped off the map. But as the German infantry moved into the ruins, they realized that the destruction worked in the favor of the defenders. The rubble made it impossible for the German panzers to move freely. Every basement, every sewer, and every pile of bricks became a Soviet strongpoint. The war of lightning-fast movement was over. In its place came the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. This was a war of the gutter. It was fought with submachine guns, flamethrowers, and sharpened spades. Battles were fought for individual rooms, for stairwells, and for landings. A single factory building might have Germans on the 3rd floor and Soviets on the 1st, with both sides fighting a desperate vertical war in between. The Soviet commander in the city, General Vasily Chukov, realized that he could neutralize the German superiority in artillery and air power by hugging the enemy. He ordered his troops to stay within 50 yards of the German lines. This meant that any German airstrike or artillery barrage risked hitting their own men. The battle became a chaotic, intimate slaughter. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and the stench of thousands of unburied bodies rotting in the sun. In the midst of this carnage, the Soviets deployed a terrifying new weapon, the sniper. The ruins of Stalingrad were a paradise for marksmen. Soviet snipers, like the legendary Vasily Zaitsev, became national heroes. They would lie motionless for days in the rubble, waiting for a glimpse of a German officer's cap or a flash of a field glass. Zaitsev alone killed over 200 Germans during the battle. The psychological impact on the German soldiers was profound. They felt as though the very ruins were watching them, waiting to kill them. Stalin also utilized the Night Witches, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. These were young women, some still in their teens, who flew obsolete plywood biplanes. They would fly over German positions at night, cut their engines, and glide silently through the darkness to drop their bombs. The only sound was the whistling of the wind in the wires of their planes, a sound the Germans likened to a broomstick. These women flew thousands of sorties, depriving the German troops of sleep and sanity. By October, the Germans had pushed the Soviets back to a narrow strip of land along the Volga, barely a few hundred yards wide. Paulus's 6th Army controlled 90% of the city. Hitler, speaking at the Bürgerbraukeller in Munich, told the world that Stalingrad had been taken. He was already planning the next phase of the war, but he was blind to the disaster brewing on his flanks. To provide enough men for the meat grinder inside the city, the Germans had moved their best units into the center, leaving the long, exposed flanks to be guarded by their allies, the Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies. These troops were poorly equipped, lacked anti-tank weapons, and had little desire to die for Hitler's glory. Deep in the Soviet rear, Stalin and his brilliant strategic mind, Georgy Zhukov, were preparing a masterpiece of deception. While the Sixth Army was bled white in the streets of Stalingrad, the Soviets were secretly massing over 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft to the north and south of the city. They called it Operation Uranus. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet trap snapped shut. A massive artillery barrage, the god of war, shook the earth. Soviet tank armies smashed through the weak Romanian lines as if they were made of paper. In just 4 days, the two Soviet prongs met at the town of Kalach. The Sixth Army, over 250,000 of the finest soldiers in the Third Reich, was completely surrounded. General Paulus, seeing the catastrophe, asked Hitler for permission to break out of the Kessel, or the cauldron. Hitler refused. He was obsessed with the prestige of holding the city. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that his planes could fly in 500 tons of supplies a day to keep the army fighting. It was a delusional boast. The Luftwaffe never managed to deliver more than a fraction of that, and the Soviet Air Force was now hunting them relentlessly. The cauldron became a frozen hell. As the second winter of the war arrived, the German soldiers began to starve. They were reduced to eating their horses, then dogs, then frozen scraps of leather. Disease swept through the ranks. Typhus and dysentery killed more men than Soviet bullets. The soldiers' summer uniforms were now rags, and they used the clothes of the dead to try and stay warm. Hitler, safe in his wolf's lair in East Prussia, sent Paulus a message. The Sixth Army will hold its position to the last man and the last round. In January 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final liquidation of the pocket. They compressed the Germans into an ever-shrinking area of ruins. The last German airfield was captured, cutting off the final hope for supplies or evacuation. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Führer promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. It was a cynical gesture. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide to save the honor of the German officer corps. But Paulus had seen enough of Hitler's honor. On January 31st, he walked out of his headquarters in the basement of a ruined department store and surrendered to a young Soviet lieutenant. 2 days later, the last pockets of German resistance surrendered. Of the 250,000 men who had been surrounded in November, only 91,000 were still alive to be marched into the depths of the Soviet Union. The pride of the Wehrmacht had been annihilated. The cost of the battle was beyond human comprehension. The Axis powers lost nearly 800,000 men. The Soviet Union, though victorious, suffered over 1.1 million military casualties, along with countless thousands of civilians. The city of Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a vast, scorched field of bones. The news of the defeat sent a shockwave through Germany. For the first time, the Nazi regime was forced to admit a major disaster. Goebbels declared a state of total war. But the aura of Nazi invincibility was gone forever. Stalingrad was the turning point of the Second World War. From this moment on, the German army would never again hold the strategic initiative in the East. The master race was now on a long, bloody retreat that would end only in the ruins of Berlin. Hitler's arrogance, his racism, and his refusal to face reality had led his nation into a meat grinder that destroyed his finest army. He had underestimated the Russian people, the Russian winter, and the ruthless resolve of Joseph Stalin. The Battle of Stalingrad remains a somber monument to the madness of total war, a place where the ambitions of 2 men led to the deaths of 2 million. It was the graveyard of the Reich and the beginning of the end for the Nazi nightmare. If you want more untold stories from history's darkest and most defining moments, make sure to subscribe to Historia and tell us in the comments which battle or historical event should we uncover next. Bye for now.